Good morning, everybody. My name is Sheldon Garrison, and on behalf of Global Genes and the Orphan Disease Center, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this session on basket and umbrella trials in the context of patient-centered research. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and we're really looking forward to this presentation. Before we get everything kicked off, I want to review a few brief housekeeping notes. The chat box to the left of the video allows you to interact with each other and the program staff, and we really hope you use this opportunity to make some new connections. Please note that the links and resources are not able to be shared via this chat. If you would like to upload any shared resources for the community, please share those on the social wall. The questions box is located to the left of your screen. We encourage you to use the questions box to share your questions with the presenters. This is the time to find answers and insights to help you advance your work as a partner in research. Please note that the speakers will not be able to see any questions entered in the chat area rather than the official questions section. If we're not able to answer all the questions, we'll do our best to follow up after. To the right of your video, you'll see captions and translations. To utilize either, please expand that session and select your language. Thank you to Horizon and Greenwich Biosciences for their support with these tools. If you have any questions about the technology or the program, please look for the request support button in each session or the live support chat in the bottom right-hand corner of all non-session pages. Finally, we encourage you to participate as active listeners and take advantage of an opportunity to hear from leaders and experts here and ask questions from them. We want to ensure that we've created a relevant and impactful program for you and greatly appreciate you sharing your time with us. And now I am pleased to announce our expert presenter today, Dr. Havinge. If there's any questions, again, please go ahead and enter them in the question box. So with that, I'll turn it over to Colin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me for this presentation. I'm excited. This is an area that I'm very passionate about. I work with the rare disease community outside of my day job. So I feel very fortunate to be able to speak to this audience. Just a bit about me. I'm the Senior Vice President of an organization called IAC for Children. We are a public-private partnership as a nonprofit with our goal to advance pediatric drug development. So we work with clinical trial sites, we work with sponsors, we work with the regulatory agencies to really come up with best solutions to how to advance drug development. So this topic is near and dear, so we'll get started. There we go. Oops. Now, you all can appreciate this. With rare disease, there's some unique challenges to drug development. Pediatrics alone has its own challenges, but if you add another layer on top of that, you're landing rare disease. In many instances, we really don't understand what the unmet medical need, what the target symptoms families most worry about, and then we don't know how the disease progresses. We don't know what an outcome, what the trajectory is, and whatnot. And this is sort of a moving target as we learn more about healthcare and other non-directed therapies improve. We really don't understand genetic differences and how that contributes to outcome, and what are the symptoms typically that are most valuable or to impact with pharmacological treatment. Oftentimes, we really don't have a clear study population to intervene, and that's ambiguous because there's not a lot of precedent with the studies in rare diseases. And then our endpoints may be less studied, and that can cause problems, particularly if they haven't been validated adequately or they rely too heavily on subjective measures. Sample sizes can be problematic, particularly for disease states that have large number of potential treatments. They can really outnumber the number of patients that might be eligible to complete those studies. One of the things I always caution people in rare disease is we're all looking for that cure or that magic bullet. But every patient that enrolls in clinical trial is a precious resource. And so it's really important to do this and do this well and choose therapies that we want to advance and do this so with as much knowledge as we can. One of the things in the regulatory world oftentimes there's no precedent. You go to regulatory agencies like the FDA or EMA, and they really haven't approved a drug for your indication before. And so those endpoints may not be as clear for them, and it takes a bit of work to figure those things out. And one of the things part of our organization as well is we have a clinical trial network, but one of the things that's a problem about most clinical trials still today is that an infrastructure for a clinical trial exists for that clinical trial, and then it's disassembled. Those investigators, pause, and they have to be reinitiated when the next drug trial comes along. But there's a latent period, and that takes valuable time. Startup times for studies may take over a year sometimes, and that's time that oftentimes we don't have. Now, one of the nonprofits I work with, in some of these slides, I will commend PPMD about. One of the things that they did as we were thinking through a platform trial with them was they surveyed their membership just to understand what the pain points were for their population. And these are some of their responses. One of the things was better inclusion criteria. They wanted disease states that really reflected the continuum of disease, and so that it wasn't just that 8-year-old boy that with mild symptoms. The other thing that was very clear was, and I think this is genuinely clear across all pediatrics, is the use of placebo in control patients and whether or not we could minimize that. But as you can see, there are other common bullet points like access to the clinical trial because of distances, decision-making, regulatory pathways, because as clinical practice, you may use combination therapies. However, in most research clinical trials that get FDA approval, that's not allowed. So that's a troublesome thing. The shorter the timelines, and then better measures for clinical outcomes. But what I really wanted to highlight there is sort of things to think about as you contemplate it as advocates and patient families, that as you think about how this might impact your disease, these things will most likely echo across any rare disease that we talk about. Now, if you look at platform trials or master trials or umbrella trials or adaptive trials, it's a lot of interchangeable language that people use very sloppily. But hopefully I'll be able to give you some information. The first thing we'll talk about is a master protocol. Master protocol, when you think about it, is really just an overarching clinical trial to test a specific hypothesis, which means it's going after a specific indication or symptom or whatnot, and that's what you're looking at. The thing is, it's a standardized patient population and a standardized assessment. It's basically you're going in and it's reproducible, and you can do it again and again and again. Some of the master protocols will fall under different design types: umbrella, basket, and then adaptive. Sometimes adaptive trials are sometimes called platform trials, but again, the terminology gets a bit vague and unclear when people use it in lay language. Now, the key thing to understand is an umbrella trial can be adaptive, but not necessarily. As you see that Venn diagram there, and a basket can be adaptive, not necessarily. And there's different types of adaptive, and we'll talk about one sort of set today, but we could have a whole conversation about that's separate. Now, I wanted to set the stage with what does a traditional trial look like? And this is the one that many of you may be most familiar. Really, it's one treatment, a single condition is studied. A treatment is compared against a control group that receives placebo. And then an outcome measure is determined to determine whether or not a drug is efficacious, or if there's safety, then people will look at safety and compare that against placebo. The thing is about this is it's a one study. It's an island in all things. You can compare multiple treatment doses, or sometimes you can change the stratification for the number of placebo to active treatment. But it has a lot of problems. The reason people still use it, it's the gold standard. It's what people have been using for a long time. It's the most scientifically valid from what we're most experienced with, so we use it. Problem is that, and particularly for rare diseases, it requires larger sample sizes, to show a benefit. In traditional design, half of the patients get control or no therapy. So that's worrisome. If you have a child with a progressive disorder, that's not the group you generally want to be involved in. And since only one treatment is studied at a time, and each study requires its own startup, site identification, budgets, contracting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's really slow. It's really, really slow. Now, one novel trial mechanism that a lot of these had their origins in oncology but it is called an umbrella trial. And the thing about an umbrella trial is it's targeting multiple treatments against one intervention. So basically, you take a population with a condition, and you basically assign them to various treatments. So you can randomize patients to treatment 1 or treatment 2 or treatment 3 or treatment 4, et cetera, or a placebo. Sometimes in an umbrella trial, people are subclassified by like a tissue type or a genetic background or a molecular alteration. But the whole thing is a single condition comparing a lot of different treatments. In this example, I just showed that one of the things you can do is you can look at which of the treatments are successful, which ones aren't. In this case, 1 and 3 were successful, and 4 obviously, and 2 were not. One of these can be used at any phase, 1, 2, or 3. The nice is that you can assess multiple treatments simultaneously. So you can actually, compare drugs within a specific trial. Academic people may be very interested in that, comparative effectiveness type of studies. And it's really good for situations where you have multiple compounds that may have potential benefit for your medical condition. And you can also improve the efficiency of the trial if you're allowed to share the placebo group, so you don't have to enroll as many placebo patients. Now, the other one's kind of the reverse, and it's basically a basket trial. Some people call this a bucket trial, but it's a single treatment that's assessed against multiple conditions. And in this case, is that the treatment is really selected, and the interventions are paired so that you have a potential drug that might have benefit against the conditions in which it's studied. So basically, you're allowed to use smaller patient samples as a way to get a proof of concept study done to find out if your drug really works or not. In rare disease, this is not uncommon design, just because a pharmaceutical sponsor or a researcher may think, hey, we've got this drug, the molecular pathway of this disease matches my drug. Can we see if this works? And this is very similar. I won't go over the matching points, but like I said, the drug is in disease and mechanism of action of the disease and the pathophysiology of the disease, or how it happens or caused, are paired. It's oftentimes in earlier development. It's used in rare disease. And however, it's limited because you can't pool across diseases very well because they're not the same things. And it usually works for diseases that have really significant effect, obvious common outcome variables that you can look at, like maybe length of stay or tumor growth or survival or things like that are more glaring, I guess, as an endpoint. Now, adaptive designs it's really hot right now, and the ones I'll talk about are multi-arm, multi-stage designs. And if you look at a study design, the nice thing about adaptive design is it reflects a lot sometimes of how we treat patients clinically. When we start a therapy, we don't continue on until a specific end. For most therapies, it's like you look for side effects, you look at the drugs that works, et cetera, et cetera. And with an adaptive design, it allows you to make modifications. You have to set up a schedule beforehand of when you're going to peek at the data, but it allows you to stop a treatment arm early because if it doesn't work, or you've just got an incredible effect that this drug is a blockbuster, and you don't want to have patients still randomized to a placebo group if the drug really works. You can change the randomization ratio to weight it heavily towards a responsive arm. That might be, for example, if a patient has a specific genotype and that genotype works to this medication, you want to shift patients more to that active therapy. You can change the eligible population if you see no benefit in a specific group. And you can adjust the treatment doses if you see the dosing in those studies is not effective or is producing unnecessary side effects. This just gives you an example from I-SPY, and actually is the Bayesian approach, but the gist is if you look at treatment A, B, and then control, in this case, an example for drug A, the patients in the red have a better outcome than control, and there's no response with the greens and basically the blues. So for drug A, there's enrichment and recruitment of patients that are have the genotype that's A. And then contrast with drug B, what you see is no difference than control. Because they're seeing this in an interim look, they stop the trial early so that you don't continue to enroll patients in a trial that is showing no clinical benefit. And of course, all of that's continued with the control group. So as you can see, there's ability to modify things. I-SPY is a breast cancer platform trial, but there's platform trials in a lot of different areas. Now, what I want to switch gears and sort of the rest of my presentation, think about this and from a practical perspective or a patient's perspective a bit, and think about more of this as an operational thing. And so how would I do this if I was thinking about do this? What are the things that would, what is the patient experience? How would you set this up, et cetera? Now, the things that are really key for success here is that you want a disease state that's ready for prime time, that there are drugs there's some understanding of a natural history, we sort of some endpoints, there's some feasibility that this will get done. One of the things that is very key are you, the patients and the advocates to this, because you're the people that will push this forward, and you're the people who will give us the meaningful information to design the trial so it's patient-centric. I cannot stress that enough. Every platform trial that I've been in discussions with, they have a seat at the table. They are the biggest contributor of those at the table. So I cannot stress the importance of this. We create a leadership and governance structure because somebody's got to carry this thing forward, because it is a bit complicated sometimes. And there's a lot of politics with it, right? When you're working across different groups of people, there's always things you have to challenges. And then a sponsor, you have something that sponsors the trial. A master protocol will have an IND, its own IND. Classically, drugs only receive INDs, but a master protocol itself has an IND. And then you can connect to a trial network or an infrastructure with experience. Sometimes it's care centers that have research that are going on. Sometimes it's a network like mine or another agency, other network that's capable of running clinical trials. And the key thing is sustainability and funding and networking with sponsors and others to carry this across the finish line. Platform trials and master trials are, Janet Woodcock, and that has been a strong proponent of master protocols and platform trials. And this is an area that the FDA has really put a lot of spotlight on and really wants to encourage. This is just giving an example from something with the DMD. I just want to highlight some points here, and use this as an example. And in this case, a platform trial has the scientific elements, of a natural history arm, ideally. It has the ability to enroll multiple drugs. It has the ability to enroll combinations. It also has supporting infrastructure, and that may be from like a clinical research organization or a data coordinating center or whatnot. But the whole idea is that you can screen therapies against a specific population and continue to enroll them indefinitely. So once this infrastructure is set up, it's in perpetuity. It doesn't have to restart it each time. It's living, breathing, and it continues to move forward. So unlike other clinical trials, we have to kickstart it each time there happens to be a drug that comes along. This infrastructure knows how to deal with that on the front end. This just gives you a little bit of the point on this slide I really want to discuss, and more importantly, is how patients sort of see this and how patients might live in this world. So looking at that black line, that's the start of the platform trial. Say the platform trial started, you have treatments available A, B, C. So the patient can be randomized to any of those treatments. In this case, then they're followed up as that goes on. Those trials end, and potentially if either they fail or they complete the trial, then they can have the option to be re-randomized to another treatment arm. That may depend a little bit on therapies, but they can be. And as you can see, since it's longitudinal, there's interconnection of how the trials operate. It's continual and whatnot. It's kind of when I think about it, it's how I think of when I was a clinician and practice more, how we manage patients. If they complete a trial, they go on to another type of therapy. Now, other things to compare. We talked about the clinical trial. The typical clinical trials are run. One intervention. They're sponsor individualized. There's a little bit more complexity. Everything's variable. With a platform trial, there's a lot of things that are set up to expedite startup. Everything from master contracts, central IRBs, pre-negotiated agreements, et cetera. You're basically recruiting a network that's capable of functioning with this trial and doing it really, really well. The master protocol, again, is really just a standardized series of assessments that you're going to use across all of the different treatment arms that are introduced into this platform trial. They're intervention independent. Sometimes there's even a menu. So like if I'm a sponsor, I can pick, I want my drug's primary endpoint to be this. The big thing about that is that everybody still gets all the assessments. It doesn't matter. Where it changed, and so the trial actually lives outside of this protocol. It lives outside of an individual drug and will continue to be ongoing. Where there's some variation sometimes, is some treatment arms may have like pharmacokinetic measurements, or they may have unique safety labs based on that specific agent. The appendix is what we call the sort of the descriptor of what that individual drug brings to the trial. So it may have the primary endpoint that they've chosen, and anything, like I said, safety or kinetics or something or unique titration that's specific to that trial. But the trial itself it lives outside of the normal clinical trial. And the way that currently it works, a drug is tied to that specific design when you study it, right? This drug is in this trial and it ends when the study ends. Now, I want to put an example here from a patient perspective, and this is from the Duchenne platform trial we've been working on with the PPMD and Critical Path, is that when a patient enters the system, it's a little different than a traditional trial. You have to consent first to join the platform trial, and based on the inclusion criteria. We've actually done a good job of expanding the inclusion criteria, so the patient population is actually bigger, and so there's more potential to enroll patients. And there's a variety of endpoints based on the symptoms that occur in DMD versus just the 6-minute walk. The other thing I just wanted to important is that they sign a consent to participate in the trial, and that's unique because it doesn't, that consent alone doesn't assign them to a treatment arm. It just says they're agreed to be involved in a treatment. One of the things that sometimes families will be concerned about is I don't get to pick which drug study I'm in exactly, because whatever trial arms are open, those are the ones you have potential to be randomized to. So like if, drug trial A, B, C, those arms are open, you can get A, B, C. If you feel like you want to be in A, you don't really get that choice. And the trade-off in this, and we've talked to families about this a lot, the trade-off most families now feel is that the more efficient study is in getting done and getting therapies to market is more important than the ability to choose. And we've had the other reciprocal where families say, I don't want to decide, and this just takes a huge burden off of me, and I can be randomized to something and contribute that way and hopefully get improvement on whatever therapy that I've been randomized to. And this just says the same thing. You're randomized to an appendix. That randomization is not blinded. You do know which trial you're in, and you have to sign a separate consent form that's aligned to your treatment arm that you assigned to. Like if you're in trial A, you get consent form A for that because it has to tell you about the side effects potential for treatment A. The schedule of visits are similar, et cetera. But the whole thing is you're really trying to understand more of the specific risks and the consents of that. You can elect to not move forward with that. That's always possible. And that's and that's someone's choice. Research in general, you can withdraw consent at any time. Now, for the last thing I want to quickly go over is that, and just sort of thinking this through, is that I've talked to you about DMD, and I'll quickly go through this, is that when you think about this, a platform trial is sort of like an incubator. And we've described it this way, is that you have a concept. The first part of it is rallying the stakeholders, getting them to the table to design this thing and to begin to fund it. Then it's to bring it to regulators after it's like a synopsis phase, when it has basically a 2-pager that kind of gives you a high level of what this thing looks like. And then to start getting feedback from a regulatory agency as a pre-IND meeting or whatnot. As you get this feedback and you get experts, find endpoints, then you polish it and you get to a type B meeting and you go after your IND for this. Most importantly, and I think this is where some people don't think about it, is that start bringing your sponsor partners, other advocacy groups, et cetera, because you want to fund it, you want to disseminate this because it's a culture change. Understand the anxiety or the concerns that families have. All those things are important to this. I think when we've done other ones, we poll the community to get responses and feedback because we really don't understand how they feel about some of the elements of the trial. And then we unveil it in a public forum meeting, so there's a discussion so families can express their concerns or understand more about what these new designs really look like because they're pretty novel. I think the last part that's really important, I won't go through all the other details, but what's really important is that you think about how to sustain it. And so what we usually try to advocate for is some kind of business model after this because it's in perpetuity, it has to have a longitudinal life. there are many platform trials that exist. So obviously they're successful and these strategies have been successful, but it's important for people that are really getting into this for the first time to sort of keep this in the back of their mind that they need to think about this. And I just want to talk about readiness just for a second of a few minutes. Now, we've been exploring this in IBD. We started headstrong into platform trial. We found our data network. We found our clinical trial network in pediatric IBD. And then suddenly we're like, whoops, we hit bumps because of differences in regulatory opinion between EMA and FDA. And so one of the things that we paused and said, okay, let's hold a workshop series that we work on the science. And in every platform trial that I've had it's been where you really go and you look at, patient-centric approach to research and then marry it with the science. And in this case, what we're going to do is create these workshops that do this and then work on things like extrapolation and design and what is an average burden for visits look like, et cetera. So we make a trial that's very patient-centric. In fact, one of our workshops is just about patients. It's dedicated to patients. And this just gives you a timeline a little bit over, but I want to say, and I stress that for rare disease, this is an opportunity. I think the rare disease community is very tight knit. It knows the people it works with. There's a lot of passion and a lot of drive. So I said, seize the moment. These innovations and tools are designed to minimize the number of patients that are required. And because I think one of the things I used to say when I was in training is I didn't want to have patients enrolled in a clinical trial I didn't feel ethically sound about. And when you always bump into that placebo for a drug that's been approved in adults, it's like, ooh, this doesn't feel so good. The thing that I encourage is that in many cases that the families are the drivers. There's potential benefit here, and I would encourage you all as patients and advocates to take the helm and to reach out to people that are interested in this space to impact your community. And I'll close with that.
That was fantastic. Thank you. We have some questions that have come in, and I'll share those with you. And the first one is, and please attendees, keep your questions coming in. We have plenty of time to get those answered. So, is it your understanding that the 21st Century CARES Act allows for basket trials in all rare diseases, or is this an oncology specific program? And the seg goes on to ask, are there examples of basket trials currently ongoing for rare diseases outside of oncology? If so.
Well, the first one is about the regulatory presence for the and whether or not that advocates for basket trials outside of oncology. I think that it's vague in that, and I think it's open. And I don't think there's discouragement. In every interaction I've had with the agency, they've been very positive about them. And if there's not a vision that is, if you ask to invite one that it has experience in that, they're a good voice for you. The second one, outside of oncology, I know of multiple sponsored studies where basket trials are being used by sponsors as ways to pilot in rare disease, and to take a drug with a mechanism and try to figure a home for it. And I feel fortunate because some of the sponsors I work with are very strong pediatric champions, realizing that, battling in the rare disease space for them is a high risk proposition, but they're taking drugs that may have utility against rare disease and trying to find a home for them. Not in that they've got already adult indication, they're using it for this, but hey, this would work in kids, let's try it. And not in oncology, outside of oncology.
Okay, is there, let's see, where are we? Okay, here we go. What will pharma / industries / academia consider when they choose a particular rare disease from the thousands of them to work on? As a single rare disease patient, how may I attract their attention?
Looking at, attracting investigators and resources to your space, I think the first one is organized strategy. I mean, when you do these, there's a lot of pitching that goes involved because you have to bring people of various, roles to the table, and it's all new, and you say the same story over and over and over again. I think the attracting for rare disease is to me, you look for first of all, is there a pipeline that exists of medications that are potential, mechanistically, if they even fit, right? You can build a platform trial even with an N of 1 study. The benefits are a little bit lower. You don't have like the ability to reduce placebo and things as much, but it starts the cascade and gets interest and proves things, and starts people being attentive in that space. Usually the things that I look for is there a pipeline? Can I get people to come to the table to discuss this? And then what I try to do is I look at the science and seeing, where we are, and I try to come up with an individualized plan for whatever that disease state is. Because even if you're not ready for a platform trial, I'll say this too, because some diseases we don't know enough. Getting a roadmap to know how to get ready for a regulatory trial, even if it's a natural history study or looking at patient-reported outcomes or validating an endpoint for a study that's meaningful, all of those things will be helpful in building a clinical trial. Like one of the problems I see with a lot of rare diseases, and I highlighted this early, is that there's no regulatory precedent. So you're having to go in and build a case, but if you haven't started to build your case, you're asking your drug to come and be studied for something that you're not sure even what you're going to measure, and whether or not that is going to be meaningful to a regulator. And so, all those things I think are really, really important. And I think you can bring academic researchers, and usually smaller biotech, I think, is also very attracted to some of these areas because they're looking for homes for molecules. And if you understand, like I'm a medical advisor from some nonprofits, and we review molecules, and we advise families about, okay, this might be worth funding, this probably is not a good idea, and I think having those voices and beginning to think about that, not just in a moment, but in a longer term picture is really, really important.
Now, you mentioned quite a few things, or talked about placebo and the placebo cohorts within the trials. Certain diseases have pretty catastrophic effects. So the DMD. Is there a line where the natural history of the disease is so well understood that you would have patient groups not be required to have that placebo treatment? And what would that outcome measure be? Like where would you draw that hard and fast line?
Sometimes historical control groups are looking at data from natural history. Is usually an item you have to negotiate for. It's not always a very clear pathway when it comes to getting drug approval. I think that's something when I go to a discussion of the FDA, it's one that's on the table. I don't know how successful I'll be with it. The other thing I think that I oftentimes think about when I'm looking at clinical conditions, there's sort of two things that are a little bit related to one another. And the first one is I want to understand what the rate of decline of a disease is. And if I can put I'll have to explain this, there's sort of a threshold for when things get too bad, or there's a threshold for when things are incredibly good for that decline change. And when I'm looking at that, is that from this perspective, what I'm arguing is that the chances of a drug being working, if I cross the success piece, is I'm trying to get for, but I also don't want patients to tilt down too low. And so it's like a futility analysis where you're comparing the rate of decline and whether or not you change the rate of decline. And and before you start those studies, you always say, okay, I don't want to go below this, or I have to stop this thing. And that's kind of how you would think about it. I will say one thing, just as a little bit of a tangent, is regulators are your friends. When you're going into these discussions, have a pre-IND. They're not formal. They don't have formal recommendations that are actionable, but they kind of point you in the right direction. So when you're talking about study designs and other things, it's really helpful to have that feedback initially. It's not binding legally, but it's a really good, hey, you shouldn't do this. And sometimes you'll find people within those divisions that will say, we've got some data internally we'd like to discuss with you, and let's think about this and how this might move forward. So it's a good thing.
We have a question that's somewhat related to the previous one, which is, how can we encourage academic researchers to pursue umbrella trials for neurodevelopmental disorders with less than 100 patients? And I'm guessing this means we're talking about the ultra rare diseases.
I think one is education, one is funding. I think one of the things that I heard that Global Genes does is, I applaud the intervention of having junior researchers work with families with rare diseases, because I think that points people in that direction. My area is neurology, so what you mentioned is near and dear. I'm a neuro person by training. But it's really, through education and whatnot, and getting, potential funding things that can get them on the table. The other thing is open your doors, because, professional education and training, most of the healthcare curriculum focuses on mainstream diseases. And so unless you study metabolic disorders or you're going to neurology or whatnot, you're probably not going to get a lot of attention in the curriculum. So reaching out to those people in those communities and sort of introducing them and sort of bringing them in. All small rare disease communities have never had anyone that's not warm and fuzzy. Families call me on the phone. I mean, just welcome people into that, and they'll start doing stuff in your space.
And I'll add to that. That's I work as a scientist, and yeah, when different advocacy groups or individual patients reach out and have these conversations, it goes a long way. Sometimes when you're in the lab, you get so caught up on something so small, and that's how you develop something. But you really do need that end goal. How are you going to help someone and improve their lives? And so having those conversations is huge. There's a website called PubMed, and if you look up particular conditions, you can find different people working on them pretty quickly.
The other thing I've found with families is that ones that are very tech savvy, they'll look up molecules, and then they'll reach out and talk to those investigators. And I have at least 3 families that have been very active in doing that, because I reviewed the protocols and kind of tell them like that, because whether or not it makes sense scientifically. I would just encourage you, don't be a stranger.
Okay, we have there's a few questions kind of around the space, but they're all tweaking a little bit different. So this will be similar, but we have someone who represents a genetic ultra rare disease that manifests as cancer. There is a consortium already working on preclinical models, which would include iPSC lines and such. What is the best path forward to go with umbrella trials, given that there are less than 200 patients in the world with aggressive cancers on diagnosis?
Usually when I think of that, what I've done, and you're at a stage, and I worked with SMA and Huntington's at one point, and what we did was, we worked out with academic researchers a mechanism by which what sort of checkpoints you had to go through to make a drug ready for proof of concept and further study. Mapping that out would really be important. I think also connecting your community would really be important, so that as a trial or other interventions go forward, that you're able to mobilize. And I think, go really, key thing there. I think other supportive information about your cancer would really, natural history is the most precious thing you can do for a researcher, just because I know it seems tedious and unexciting, but I can't tell you how hard it is to go and try to design a study when you don't know how something changes or what's meaningful or whatnot. It's like you're going in blind. You don't have, and you can't argue scientifically for what a study would even look like. And you just, and that means to me, I'm probably going to fail, because my guess is just as good as anything, and I think, allowing that structure to help, again, this is an active thing. Not all research is about the immediate cure, but it's also, building the infrastructure so that you can get to there. Not ruling out one another, but definitely, trying to get there. I know a lot of rare disease groups have been focusing on digital app technologies, develop, registries that way, so that there's more information. I think the more visibility and publications and things you get out of that space, the more attention you get from people because there's science there for them to play with, right? And I would encourage that quite a bit. I think, if there's offline conversations about your specific disease and, and what that might look like, I'm happy to entertain that at some point.
In building on that, you sparked a question for me. Who are some of the best people to bring to the table? So when developing natural history, it's usually those affected by a particular condition or their families, caregivers, or otherwise. But sometimes that data, while meaningful to that group, may be a little less meaningful to someone developing a drug because they may be excluding certain points. Who would you reach out to bring to the table as you design that?
Yeah, I mean, when I think of this, I'll put on my different hats. I've lived in lots of different worlds. Of course, you're going to bring in patient advocates because you want to design things that have patient-centric meaning. One of the limitations of a lot of those things is that there's not validated scales and things for rare diseases. So you're kind of having to work through that through focus groups and other things. I think if I was going to assemble a team right now, if someone said, okay, let's do this, it would be, I want a digital tech person because I want to build the architecture. I want someone that's an epi person. I want someone that's like me that understands regulatory because knows where I'm going to push back as a regulator and say, that's not going to fly. If you collect that, I need to know it's solid and valid and all that stuff. And then I'd want some data hub person that can store and analyze the data, that are effective way, because those things are going to really be important. Back to as you look at these things, the compliance and the validation of scales and other endpoints are things that an epi or a data person can help with. But when you're coming at, it depends what the ask is. If you're trying to validate a scale or something for a particular disease, you're probably going to have to get someone who's going to be able to do focus groups for you and other stuff like that and whatnot. But I've done this a lot. I mean, I've helped with IRBs and other things for rare diseases, help them with protocol development, and then just sort of being a devil's advocate sometimes about because I've done a lot of things in this various areas. It's good to have that because, you think you're coming up with a good idea and then having somebody shoot holes in it makes you feel so much better about yourself.
Fair. Quick question, just to clarify one point, and then we have another one in the queue. Great question in the queue. With some of these small groups, is there a hard and fast rule for the number of patients to include in, let's say, a registration study? Is there a percentage of the total known prevalence or anything like that? No? Okay.
Even age, for example. I mean, the FDA has done some interesting things with even age inclusion where they've accepted patients, labels indication that weren't enrolled in the trial. They argued that the disease was similar enough that they could include the patients down below that age group. So, yeah.
Great. And so the question we have in the box, it keeps on shifting around on me. Give me 1 second. Do you find that moving the needle towards a therapeutic happens in the scientist to pharma relationship, or are parents, advocacy groups able to drive the bench to bedside translation to have that happen more quickly? As a parent in the rare space, would reaching out to pharma move this at all?
I think to answer that question, I think it depends on the company. But I can honestly say, you know, I've seen successful strategies for patient advocacy groups and engaging pharma, you know, like, I mean, for example, have a drug, you know, disease roundtable, and that you meet with pharma regularly to understand and present your disease, and sort of marketing those things that draw attention, and whatnot, and other funding opportunities. You know, most small and mid-level pharma would be more receptive about those things. And there are ones that are very, very, you know, I don't want to say names, but I know one of them, like, they're rock stars. I mean, they went out and just plopped themselves in patient advocacy groups, and they basically helped them design the study. I mean, and it's an epilepsy condition. The group is just awesome. I've done some things with other rare diseases, you know, that you know, those companies are more apt and very responsive to listening, because and also encouraging expanded access programs, because they realize that sometimes siblings are affected, and you want to make sure that, and so I think going in those spaces is really, really important. I will honestly also tell you the downside is that the risk of those companies being gobbled by a bigger one, or your drug getting sold and sold and sold, you know, is also there. So there is potential, and I've seen it work really well. And I've seen other instances where, as a site director over research institutions, you're like, oh my God, you know, this is happening, and so, you know, goods and bads.
I'm gonna ask one more question from this. Is there any tip to seek for compassionate use for younger age than the ongoing clinical study for another disease? So,
I mean,
so something else. Yeah.
I mean, this is all conjecture. I mean, having been a pharmacist in this space, I can tell you, it's never easy navigating those things. It's not easy for your physician. I will tell you, it is one of my pet peeves has been, can you just give us an instruction manual? You know, because y'all are different. And we have no idea what you're asking us, and what the magic words are. But I think, you know, one of the things I always encourage families is to communicate with your clinician, but also own it. Because what I mean by own it is, you can reach out to drug information, you can reach out to this, find out what's needed for compassionate use, what documentation, so you can basically hand it to your clinician to get pursued. Because sometimes it even requires an individual IND. So there's specific questions you can ask that will help, so that you're not tied up in lingo land. And some really good pharmas, there's a couple of them, I think, that have started to join up, like a joint help desk, you know, for things like this. But it's the weight's on yours. And I will honestly tell you, your clinician is probably very, very confused, because they're not easy to advocate. One of the things that used to be my drop on my desk was figure out how to make this happen. And to figure out to make this happen has no logic. And no rules. And so you have to go through the persistence of doing that is something that, you know, parents that are informed can help. Like, I remember my last one, I had to working with the company, and you as a parent can be a champion because there's other people behind you. But one parent had done a really good job, as you know, preparing like an individual IND that everybody could copy, because then once that was set up, you know, they had the pathway done, they just shared it. And so everybody could go under it. And it was just like, you know, awesome, because, you know, that person made everybody's life so much easier. And all the families were because it was, all the stuff was off label, and it was for indications that were sort of tangential to the primary. You know, it's kind of felt like, in this case, it was it was an epilepsy indication, and there's a lot of epilepsy rare disease syndromes. And so, you know, one parent had figured out for their child who didn't have the age requirement nor the disease requirement. and to get an individual IND, and basically everybody just jumped on that one and and did it. So I hope that answered that question. As I said, if there's anybody that has questions or things out after the calls, just email me. I've never had anybody abuse that yet, knock on wood. I used to have people, and most of the time people are scared of you, and whatnot. So feel free to ask questions, and if I can help, I will.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Colin, for your presentation and the discussion, fielding all these great questions. Before you head to the next session, please take a few moments to respond to the polls that are being launched now. We all appreciate your feedback in this session and want to ensure that we're able to provide great content and programming for the rare disease community. You can also share your feedback via events@globalgenes.org. Up next, join us in the poster hall to visit posters, chat with researchers, learn about their exciting projects. And please join us again for this afternoon's plenary sessions on endpoints and advances in new therapeutic approaches. Additionally, we want to remind you that we will still be hosting office hours and informal networking rooms after the official close of the program at 3:30 Eastern Time. Please join us to discuss content of the day, meet your peers, and connect with speakers and experts. We know there's a lot of content here, and we want to make sure that you walk away with a robust toolbox to advance research in your own community. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.